I'll give you a little background about myself first. I am married, in my early 20s, and my husband and I are expecting. I firmly believe I grew up in a haunted house, and I firmly believe that the activity has followed me ever since childhood. I won't go into any of the details about what happened in the past. That would literally take hours. Instead, I'll tell you about what's happening now. We've lived in our current home for about 2 years now. For the past year or so, I sincerely feel that we have been experiencing paranormal activity. In the last few months, it has only gotten worse. I don't remember when exactly it began, but I do remember what it began as. I was home alone and my husband was at work. We had recently changed shifts, and he now worked opposite of me. Before that, we had always worked the same hours. I was laying down on the couch to rest when I noticed the sound of scurrying on the second floor. We do have pets, and over the last 2 years, I have certainly gotten to know the sounds of their feet as they race across the floor. I didn't think much of it until I looked over and noticed that our cats and dogs were all laying down on the living room floor. I heard the sound of the scurrying again, and a chill went down my back. I slowly and somewhat reluctantly made my way up the stairs to the second floor to investigate the sounds. To give you some idea of how loud the sound was the second time, our upstairs floors are carpeted, and the sound was not unlike that of a small child running around. With every step I took climbing those stairs, I kept trying desperately to convince myself that it was just perhaps rodents or maybe even a raccoon that had found its way inside through an opening somewhere. And with every step I took, those comforting thoughts seemed to slowly fade into nothingness while a sense of dread took their place. I reached the top of the stairs, and for a reason I cannot possibly explain, I called out hello. I don't know if I was expecting to hear someone reply, and as soon as the words left my mouth, I would have given anything to rewind time and stop myself from even making the slightest peep. I stood there immersed in the silence for several long minutes. I didn't hear anything, and the longer I stood there in the quiet, the more confident I began to feel. I decided to make a quick check of the rooms, and by quick I mean lightning fast. I went from room to room, even checking inside closets and under the bed to see what could have made the sounds. But when I didn't find anything, I didn't know whether to be relieved or even more paranoid. I went back downstairs and laid on the couch once more. I wasn't tired now, but I wanted to make myself sleep. If nothing else, just to pass the time sooner until my husband got home from work. I closed my eyes and tried to think of nothing as I took long, deep breaths, hoping sleep would come fast. And then, the scurrying started again, right overhead in our bedroom, right above where I was laying. I bit down on my bottom lip, covered my hands over my ears, and squeezed my eyes shut as tightly as I could. It was a few weeks later, and I had already told my husband about what had happened. He assured me that I was probably just hearing things and not to let my imagination get all worked up over something that most likely wasn't a ghost. At this point, I had still been sleeping on the couch because I was too afraid to sleep in the bedroom, since it happens to be where I last heard the noises come from. My husband convinced me to just try sleeping upstairs one time, and he promised me that everything would be just fine. I love him, so of course I believed him. We slept in the room and everything seemed just fine. Neither of us heard anything, and I had nearly forgotten about it until one day when I slept there by myself while he worked overnight. I woke up in the pitch-black bedroom to the sound and sensation of someone breathing right over me as I lay there in the darkness. I could just barely make out the faint glow of light on the wall from the alarm clock behind me. It was the only light source in the room, and a terrifying thought overtook me as the idea of turning around to see whatever was making this noise while it was illuminated by the alarm clock entered my head. Part of me wanted to turn around and see it, but my adrenaline was practically whispering to me now, "Run. Run." I jumped from the bed and ran downstairs. I called my husband at work and begged him to come home. I turned on all the lights and television, and I sat there shaking in fear. When he came home, I told him about what had happened, and he seemed to take it a bit more seriously this time. He believed what I said, at least at first. But as time went on, he seemed to find ways to dismiss it. After we found out I was expecting, I had stopped working. This meant way too much time in the house alone, which meant cranking the TV all the way up, leaving all the lights on when it got dark, and never setting foot upstairs. After a while though, even with the TV on, sometimes even the stereo, I could still hear things. The scurrying noise got louder and more frequent. I also started hearing a new sound, a raspy growling noise that seemed to be coming from the upstairs. I told a friend about it, and he decided that he was going to come over and hear these things for himself. He's really into horror and supernatural things, and in a way, he's addicted to the adrenaline rush of a good scare. At first I pleaded with him not to come over, but after a while I just gave in and I said okay. He decided to come at night and bring a camera with him. My husband was there too. My friend went from room to room snapping photos and taunting whatever was there. It made me extremely uncomfortable, and my husband just seemed annoyed. He kept coming over and showing me photos that he had snapped and tried to convince me that every light reflection or speck of dust must be a ghost or something. Now I was getting annoyed too. We all went upstairs for a few more photos. For the first time in a long time, I sat on our bed while my friend stood in the doorway and snapped photo after photo. My husband, who was both bored and sick of my friend, went back downstairs. I was just about to ask my friend to please go home when he shouted for me to come over and look at the camera screen. I really didn't want to sit there and have him try to convince me that there was a ghost face in another dust particle, but I figured I'd at least humor him before tossing him out. He handed me the camera and said, "Look at the TV screen." To my horror, I saw clearly what he was seeing. There was no need for him to try to convince me to see something in the photo. I could already see it for myself. I could see my silhouette reflected onto the TV screen. I was sitting perfectly still on the bed. I could make out my head, shoulders, and even a bit of the color from my shirt. And I could also see it for the first time. A tall, dark figure sitting on the bed next to me, reflected in the TV screen. This happened when I was around 14 or 15. I considered myself a daredevil. If you dared me to do something, even if it was stupid and potentially dangerous, I'd do it, especially if there was a wager involved. I don't know if all kids go through this, as I can only speak from my experiences, but I had always considered trespassing and going into off-limit places to be thrilling. If there was a sign posted to keep out, and I knew there was a chance of getting caught, I considered it to be bragging rights if I got in and out without anybody knowing. If it was an abandoned place, I'd always take something from there to prove that I had been there, or I'd make some sort of mark so anyone that went there after me knew that I was there first. It didn't matter to me if it was a farmer's field and barn, vacant house, abandoned store, you name it. I took every opportunity I could to get in to explore those types of places and see what was there. And whether it was writing my name on a wall or taking something, I always made sure I had proof that I had been there. Since I wasn't old enough to drive at the time, I had to walk everywhere. That was fine at first because the economy was bad and there were a lot of vacant places for me to check out. But once I had been in just about every location within walking distance, I started needing to go further and further from home to find places. I wasn't running out by any means, there was plenty to explore. But it was taking longer for me to get to places, and after a while, the places I was going to just didn't seem that interesting. I don't think it was because I had been doing it too much, but I felt it was because there wasn't anything exciting in the last half dozen or so locations. The last few houses were completely empty, and the one store I had gone inside only had a few metal shelves left inside of it. I hate myself for doing this, but I actually broke the windows just because I felt so disappointed. I took some time off from my trespassing pastime to hang out with friends and focus on other stuff. I was talking with two friends about wanting something really exciting to do, and they both made the same suggestion that I should try to get inside the witch's house. At first I thought I misheard them, but then they repeated it. Witch's house. I had no clue what they were talking about, and one of my friends explained that there was a small abandoned house at the end of a one-way road. The grass is all overgrown and the property had been empty for over 20 years. They told me that a witch had lived in the house, and she performed black magic. One day she was confronted by the police, and she tried to attack them with a knife. They told me the police shot her 8 times before she finally fell. They then both told me similar stories of experiences they had had while riding their bikes past the house. They had both gone separately to take a closer look at the house. Each of them swore up and down that they could feel someone watching them as they pulled up to the front of the property. I couldn't help but laugh a little bit at both of them, as I was completely certain they were pulling my leg and just trying to scare me. They both looked really mad when I did, and then did the one thing they knew I could never say no to. They both dared me to go into the house that night and bring back proof that I was inside. "You're on," I said with a smirk. That night I got one of them to loan me their bike so I could get there faster. The house is pretty far from mine, and even though I left home when I had about an hour or so of daylight left, it was already dark by the time I pulled up to the front of the house. It certainly looked creepy. The windows were all boarded up and the grass was several feet high. I could see that the roof was starting to cave in and the paint was all chipped and sun-faded. It was like something out of a horror film, and it only made me even more eager to get inside. I laid my bike down inside the grass to hide it just in case someone drove by, like the police. I grabbed my flashlight from my pocket and I made my way through the tall grass toward the house. It was a struggle to get through just with the denseness, and the wet ground from the rain earlier made it almost exhausting. As I approached the front of the house, I could see that the front door had a board nailed over it at some point because it was now laying on the front porch. There looked to be some pry marks on the door where someone had used a crowbar to pull the board off. I was a bit upset that someone had beat me to it, but I figured it would be a waste of time to come all this way just to leave without even going inside. I also didn't want to leave without proof that I had been inside the house, so I reached for the door handle and gave it a pull. To my surprise, it didn't open. It didn't even budge. I could feel the handle click, but the door would not move. I took a closer look at the frame of the door, and it became apparent why. All along the door, someone had driven screws through the door and into the frame. I looked over at the boarded up windows and gave a hard tug to the planks. They didn't move either. I was starting to think that I wasn't getting inside that night as my entrance points were diminishing. I pushed my way through the tall grass and made my way to the back of the house, where I was greeted with more boarded up windows and another immovable door. Now I was mad. Mad and disappointed at the prospect of going back home empty-handed and having to face my friends the next day. Not wanting to be defeated, I made one final check of the house when I noticed a basement window that appeared to have been boarded up with a small piece of plywood from the inside. I gave one solid kick to the board, and with a loud snap, it broke free from the window and landed into the darkness below. I shimmied through the small window and felt the crunch of broken glass beneath my shoes from the window that had previously been there before someone put plywood over it. With my flashlight in hand, I was eager to explore the small interior, but a nagging thought inside the back of my mind kept me in place for a few moments. Why was this the only window boarded up from the inside? I made my way through the cluttered basement in search of the stairs to the first floor. I kept thinking I'd see cauldrons and candles, all the stereotypical witch artifacts that my teenage brain imagined would be inside. Instead, I just saw mountains of junk, the typical mess you'd find in most basements. I began to cough from the mustiness, and as I finally located and made my way up the steps to the first floor, I noticed a sound coming from inside the house just after I let out my last cough. It sounded like a pile of junk collapsing onto the floor. I was startled by it, and I frantically began to pan my flashlight around the room to see where it came from. All I could see was dust floating in the air, tons of junk, and what appeared to be black trash bags scattered everywhere. I could see the stairs for the second floor, but decided that with the roof caving in like it was probably best not to go upstairs. I was still creeped out by the noise I had just heard, and I quickly glanced around the room for something to take with me to show my friends. I could see what appeared to be a coffee table covered in various knickknacks, and I decided to just reach and take the first item that I touched, which I believe was a candle holder of some sort. I had no sooner touched the tarnished metal when I heard the same sound again, followed by a voice.
That's not yours.
I let out a scream and I ran as fast as I could down the basement stairs and out the small basement window. I felt like I was moving in slow motion as I tried desperately to fight my way through the tall grass. I tripped over my friend's bike and I frantically pulled it from the grass and onto the road as I pedaled as fast as I could to get home, never looking back, not even once. The next day I returned my friend's bike to him, still covered in grass and mud. I told him what had happened and that I was done exploring. If nothing else, I hope this serves as a cautionary tale for anyone thinking of doing anything like this. Unless you're supposed to be there, you should probably just stay out.